Most news is bad news. There's always a war happening somewhere in the world, always a dictator messing up his country. But if you're like me, things globally feel extra unsettling at the moment. A lot of conflicts seem to be meshing together, and it might make you wonder, are we kind of in World War III? Think about it. There's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that's the European front. Then we have Israel's war on Gaza, and now this Iran conflict, we're looking at the Middle Eastern theater with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, impacting economies from Vietnam to Germany. Plus, the fighting has extended from off the coast of Sri Lanka, where the U.S. Navy sank an Iranian vessel, all the way to Cyprus, where Iranian drones targeted a British military base, down to the Chagos Islands, where Iran aimed its missiles at yet another British base. There's also a third front we tend to forget, the digital front, where state-backed hackers fight online battles and where disinformation campaigns manipulate social media platforms. At a minimum, it looks like we've got three fronts. Doesn't that kind of make this a global conflict? And if it's a global conflict, then are we in a world war but are just in denial about it? What I mean is the First World War was not called the First World War until it was over. The term actually didn't get traction until the 1930s. So are we just missing the benefit of hindsight here? I decided to present this question to a group of international affairs experts. Their answers were fascinating. We'll start with Kori Schake. She's senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C. Kori's answer was clear.
No, I don't think we are in World War III for two reasons. First, the United States isn't facing an adversary that is requiring us to create a broad global coalition and an integrated political, economic, and military strategy to confront. You could argue China poses that level of challenge, but the Trump administration is certainly not behaving as though that were the case. So that's the first reason. I don't think there's a mission that requires that level of American effort. And second, I don't think President Trump is capable of the grit to see through an important challenge like that. I think what we saw in other places is that President Trump undertakes the use of military force when he believes it can be quick and decisive. And if it's not quick and decisive, he loses his nerve.
Next, I turn to David Ariosto. David is a space industry analyst, but before that, he was an international journalist reporting everywhere from Afghanistan to Cuba. David also said, no, we're not in a world war, but this might be more like the Cold War.
There's a lot that's in this, right? There's a lot to unpack within the course of this question. And if we are to characterize world wars by direct combat between major powers and global scale military engagement and sort of a full economic and social mobilization, then no, we're not in that construct. Whether we're sleepwalking, as has been suggested, into a sort of Archduke Ferdinand type of situation is a different question. But I would say that we're probably much more likely in a situation that's akin to the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, it wasn't absent of conflict. There was the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Soviet-Afghan conflict. There was conflicts in Latin America, wars in Africa, and tensions and coups in the Middle East. You know, these were global in nature, but nobody was calling those world wars. Or now, you know, is it possible with sort of the growing connectivity and, you know, the nature of autonomous warfare and the influence clearly that there is an active cyber campaign going back and forth between the United States and China and Russia and Iran? No question. If we define these things by different terms, then you could say that we're heading towards that. But I think commentary like World War III sometimes speaks to the attention economy that we all kind of find ourselves into.
Ooh, did David throw a bit of shade my way there? That's okay, I get it. This can be a bit of a clickbaity question. But in my defense, I get asked this a lot, and I think it's a legitimate question if you're not an expert and you're just following the news. Because it feels as if globally we are at an inflection point right now.
Not to say that we're not entering an incredibly high-risk situation in which the geopolitics could escalate very, very quickly, given who's in this administration, who's in China, and who's certainly in the Kremlin. But I would say categorically no, because you're just not seeing that mass mobilization and the tens of thousands, of hundreds of thousands in some instances, soldiers, and a rejiggering of the entire economy to focus on a war effort. Now, could it happen? Possibly, but I don't know that it helps.
Next, we have Ken Moriyasu, senior fellow at the think tank the Hudson Institute in Washington, and until recently a top international correspondent at Nikkei Asia.
I don't know if we are in a third world war, but it's very crucial to make sure that it doesn't happen. And the way to understand, to make sure that it doesn't happen is to understand what is happening in the world. And what I think is happening is that Russia and China and Iran in the Eurasian heartland is teaming up to solidify their strengths and making sure that the U.S. They see the U.S. as a block, a hurdle, obstacle to their ascendance. So I think there needs to be a focus on this reality. In that context, in Japan, there's a lot of opposition to what's happening in Iran, and I understand that. Trump didn't go to the UN. Trump's messaging on Iran is all over the place, and it's very easy to oppose it. But I think if we see it in that great power competition, what's happening, having Iran a crucial part of that trilateral bloc being weakened is very much in Japan's strategic interest. Partly because of geography and the access it gives to Central Asia and all of that, but also it shows that China's narrative that the West is in decline, the East is on the rise, and that China, not the US, will be the force of stability and the security guarantor. That logic is falling apart because China really couldn't protect Iran.
Last but not least on our roster of experts is Jasmin Mujanovic. He's a political scientist on European affairs and host of the International Affairs podcast Balkanomnikon. Jasmin echoes what David Ariosto said earlier. He thinks what we're looking at is much more like the Cold War rather than a world war.
I understand the desire to describe the current moment in international relations and geopolitics as World War III. I think for my purposes, I actually think of it more as like a Cold War II or Cold War 1.5, right? Because in many ways, this is much more clearly a direct continuation of the, shall we say, major tensions and major alignments of the Cold War than it is of, shall we say, World War II. I mean, I don't know if people necessarily are drawing a intellectual link between World War I and World War III, but from a chronological and ideological standpoint, the current alignment much more closely aligns to the period that we saw after World War II than sort of any permutation of what happened during the Second World War. I mean, you could also arguably suggest that this is in fact a return to kind of 19th century style great power politics, a kind of riff on the concert of Europe, Russia as a kind of imperial revanchist power that is trying to elbow its way into Europe, feeling like it has been pushed out of what it considers its own kind of historical arena. You could also argue that this is potentially a repeat of 19th century style great power politics, because we see many of the similar dynamics playing out both in places like China and Russia, where we're seeing leaders in Beijing and Moscow saying, projecting, signaling to neighboring states, but also its kind of global competitors, we have spheres of influence, we have spheres of domination. And yes, those may include nominally sovereign states, but we believe ultimately we are the ones who are going to direct domestic decision-making, policy-making in those capitals directly or indirectly, right? So I think World War III, I understand sort of the desire, because it seems like a catchy title. It seems like a bombastic title, no pun intended. But again, I think from my purposes as a political scientist, as somebody interested in history, I see this much more as a continuation of the Cold War. And certainly, as I said, I do see some fragments of that form of 19th century imperial politics. I think the ultimate question here is not necessarily so much, how are the great powers aligning in and of themselves? To my mind, the key question is, how are the publics of global states aligning individually and amongst themselves? Because actually what Hungary shows us is that even when you have a illiberal or authoritarian regime, that does not necessarily, and in fact in most cases does not accurately reflect the desires and aspirations of their own publics. In Hungary, we see a sustained clash between, broadly speaking, the democratic and liberal aspirations of the Hungarian public versus the illiberal and autocratic pretensions of one particular movement that successfully seized power. And I think those kinds of fissures exist across the board. In some societies less so than others, but I think it's generally something that we can see playing out across the globe. So as much as there is that kind of, headline great power competition, even conflict that we're seeing, whether it's in the Persian Gulf, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's, God forbid, tomorrow in the Taiwan Strait, at the same time, there is also, I think, the even more important question of where is the sort of democratic zeitgeist of individual publics heading? Because that is the kind of reserve salvation, as it were, for a kind of different way, right? In so much as we can still hold out hope for something like a return to a global liberal democratic norm, the reservoir of that, the capacity for that is going to be among citizens themselves rather than their leaders, whether they're good, bad, or something in between.
So there you go. 4 experts, 4 explanations, and 1 consensus. They all agree, no, we are not in World War III. Well, what do you think? Do you agree with their analysis? Let us know in the comments. That's all for now. DW News is giving you the latest and also sharing deep dives on here and across the rest of social media. I'm Melissa Chan. Until next time.